Hello, good people. Welcome back to Unlearning to Learn with Tato, where we debunk myths and change our old ways of thinking. I am Tato. I've been gone for quite some time. Hey, it's been a minute. Life was lifing, but I'm back now, and that's all that matters. And I am back with the heat, literally. So I recently bought a microphone, but I didn't know that I was gonna need an audio interface, slash phantom power supply. So I was kind of like contemplating if I should shoot my first video or if I should wait up until I buy the audio interface. Mind you, it's very expensive. So I was just like, you know what, let me just shoot. I mean, the microphone works, but it's not as powerful as it would be if I had an audio interface, you know. But I'll just buy it as time goes on. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about a very, very sensitive yet important topic. I was also kind of contemplating talking about this topic because it's something that I recently had to also unlearn myself. So I was a bit skeptical, you know, but I was like, you know what, let me just talk about it. So we're here now. So today we're going to be talking about vulnerability and learning the idea that vulnerability is a weakness. Honestly, I was one of those people that didn't understand vulnerability, and I definitely saw vulnerability as a weakness. Like, whenever I would see people being vulnerable and crying and expressing their emotions, I'd be like, yo, like, why are you crying? Like, that's weird. Like, be strong, you know? So I definitely did see vulnerability as a weakness. I didn't understand the concept of being vulnerable or the importance of vulnerability. I was more of a, you know, being logical person than an emotional person, if that makes sense. So I definitely didn't understand the whole opening up thing and showing people your weakness and being vulnerable. It's only now in my 20s where I'm seeing the importance of being vulnerable. Like, vulnerability is very, very critical, very, very important. And we might have different definitions of vulnerability, but in simple terms, vulnerability is the willingness to show emotion once the willingness to risk being emotionally hurt, the willingness to for one's weakness to be seen and known. And while I was preparing for this episode, when I was doing my research, I actually found that a lot of people still struggle with the idea of being vulnerable. Like, a lot of people haven't grasped the idea of vulnerability, the importance of vulnerability. And for some people, it might stem from childhood, you know. You were never really taught how to be vulnerable. Whenever you express your emotions and want to be vulnerable, you were shut off. And whenever you'd cry, you would be told to not cry, you know. Or sometimes it might be that you were once vulnerable but with the wrong person, and it resulted in you shutting down the idea of vulnerability. And, you know, oftentimes growing up, we are taught that crying and expressing your emotions is a bad thing. For example, when you are crying, you're told to, like, you know, wipe your tears. Why are you crying? Like, be strong, you know, you're being weak. So you start growing up with the idea that, oh, okay, so when I'm being vulnerable and expressing my emotions, I'm being weak. So that means I should keep things in. You know, I think definitely for me, it was growing up, I never really had, like, you know, a safe space to be vulnerable and express my emotions. So I think that I started growing up with this thing of keeping things in, and that for me started being a normal thing, to keep things in. And I think that's where a lot of people start having this idea that vulnerability is a weakness. And it's actually funny because vulnerability holds so much power and freedom. I definitely was that person that I thought me not being vulnerable was actually me having power, you know, and having freedom. But when you start getting into the world of being vulnerable, that's when you actually discover that, oh, actually, being vulnerable is where actually there's freedom and there's power. Vulnerability holds so much power, so much freedom, because obviously if you're not being vulnerable, you're keeping things in, and you don't have freedom. But when you're being vulnerable and expressing your emotions, you are relieved, and that's why I'm saying it holds so much freedom. I mean, putting up walls and masking your emotions and facades, it's very tiring, because obviously if you are not being vulnerable and you don't understand the concept of vulnerability and expressing your emotions, you're obviously putting up walls and facades and you're masking your emotions, and that is tiring. It's better to be vulnerable than to have to put up walls and put up facades and mask your emotions. Trust me. I mean, I didn't see it that way. I saw it as me protecting. And usually when people are not being vulnerable and they don't understand vulnerability, they think they're protecting themselves, but you're actually, funny enough, you are killing yourself. You are killing yourself, because we are created in a way where we have to, like, being vulnerable is part of our human experience. At some point in your life, you have to be vulnerable. So because we're created in a way where vulnerability is a important aspect of our lives, when you're not practicing that, when not being vulnerable, you may not see it in that moment, but it's definitely killing you. I mean, putting up walls and facades and keeping things in, it's so draining. It leaves you feeling powerless. It takes so much from you. It takes so much energy. It takes so much energy. Having to pretend, having to put on this image that you are perfect and you have it all together. Draining. Trust me, draining. And it's draining because that's not how you were created. You were created to have how do I put it? An element of showing emotion or being vulnerable, in simple terms. And again, vulnerability holds so much healing. There's so much healing in being vulnerable. Oh my word, if only I knew back then. If only I knew. There is so much healing in vulnerability. So much healing. And oftentimes, another thing that I've also discovered, as I'm also still on the process of understanding vulnerability and getting into this whole being vulnerable world, oftentimes the devil doesn't want you to be vulnerable, because he knows that that's when you're going to find your healing. He knows that you're going to find your healing. So he feeds you these lies that you don't have to have a support system. You don't have to go to anyone and tell them what you're dealing with or express your emotions, because he knows that there is healing in being vulnerable. There is so much healing in being vulnerable. Like, vulnerability carries so much healing. And actually, being vulnerable and expressing your emotions is actually emotional intelligence. Literally. Being able to be vulnerable, opening up, and expressing your emotion, that is emotional intelligence. It's a part of being emotionally intelligent, because when you're not being vulnerable and you're keeping things in, most of the time it gets to a point where you end up expressing your emotions in a how do I put it? Not so healthy way, because things are just building up. Things are just building up, and it gets to a point where you just burst, and usually it's not cute. Like in that moment, nothing is cute. So that's what I'm saying. Being vulnerable and being able to show emotion and express your emotions, that is emotional intelligence. But yeah, moving on, vulnerability allows you a deeper connection with yourself and with other people. But most importantly, it allows you a deeper connection with yourself because you're able to be honest with yourself. I mean, we should remember that we are built in a way whereby we have emotions, and you have to express your emotions. You can't suppress your emotions. I mean, you can, and you think that's okay, but it's going to catch up with you. So this is why vulnerability is a very, very important thing to learn and to understand. Vulnerability leads to uninhibited authenticity, strength, and growth. I was listening to a podcast by Jay Shetty, and he was interviewing Dr. Gabor Mati, and he was saying vulnerability itself is absolutely essential for growth. Everything in nature grows only where it's vulnerable. The moment you stop being vulnerable, you stop growing. So you can just see how vulnerability is very critical. For you to be able to grow, you need to be vulnerable. It is a very, very important element in one's life to be able to be vulnerable. Because when you stop being vulnerable, you stop growing. You cannot grow without vulnerability. And I think the most important thing about being vulnerable is being vulnerable with the right person. Because I mean, you can be vulnerable, but to the wrong person, it can make you shut down the whole idea of being vulnerable. So being vulnerable to the right person, that's where it's going to lead you to growth. So vulnerability is a very, very important aspect for growth. We should unlearn the idea that vulnerability is a weakness. We should actually come to a point where we master the art of being vulnerable. Yeah, we should come to a point where we master the art of being vulnerable. So yeah, so vulnerability is actually strength. It's not weakness. Vulnerability is very, very critical. Because we're created with emotions, we need to be able to be vulnerable and express our emotions in a healthy way. So yeah, thank you for tuning in and listening to my podcast. I want to hear your guys' thoughts. So please, in the comment section, tell me what vulnerability means to you, and if you are at a point where you have mastered the art of being vulnerable, and if not, what's stopping you from being vulnerable. I also want to hear your ideas. As I said, this podcast is all about me learning from you guys as well, changing our old ways of thinking. So meaning that I want to hear your guys' perspective. So in the comment section, please tell me what you think about vulnerability. So yeah, thank you for tuning in. You know the vibes, you know what's up. Up until next time. Bye.